What is tax? Why is it important? Why do we need to pay it? Where does the money go to? If you're someone who's interested to learn more about this, then this conversation is for you. Today, I'm joined by two experts in this topic, Dr. Amna Khalifa, an international fiscal economist and UNDP's technical specialist and also outreach specialist on taxation and SDGs, and also Dr. Lyla Latif, an advocate for the courts of Kenya and also UNDP's technical specialist on taxation and SDGs and financial instruments. I'm Hakshala David, Junior Economist Innovative Financing, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to UNDP Sri Lanka's podcast series, What the Tax? Amna, Lyla, so happy to have you here with us. Thank you so much for doing this. Now, for those of us who are tuning in for the very first time, this is our second episode. The first episode is where we unpacked a little bit about the basics of taxation. What is taxation? Why is it important? What kind of different taxes are we paying? What the composition is like, etc. So today's episode is more to delve deeper in order to understand the connection between taxes and the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. So on that note, Amna, I want to hear from you first. Before we even talk about SDGs, let's talk about taxes and development. Now, as we know, this conversation is relatively new. Maybe it must have started as early as 2010. However, there's global consensus where we have an understanding of why this relationship is important. There's an explicit understanding of taxes and development. So, in a basic sense, can you tell us what is this relationship all about, taxes and development?
So, Hakshala, we understand that countries and governments need resources and funds. They need that to spur economic growth. They need that to spend on their public in terms of providing for health, education, infrastructure. So where is this funding going to come from? One of the main sources is domestic resource mobilization, which really means how does the government collect funds for its spending. And that's how they can come up with extra funds to be able to spend on these different development areas. But currently what is happening, and everyone understands what's going on in the world now, countries, mostly developing countries, have really come up with very high unsustainable debts. Their fiscal deficits, they have less funds to spend on development. Think of it like this way. Think of a family whose interest rates have gone up, so they have to pay more and more towards their home loans. And they're able to manage that for the short time by cutting on food, by cutting on education, by cutting on buying medicines. But that can't go on for long. For how long can they skip their meals? For how long can they keep the children out of the school? For how long can they go on without the medicine? So what do? They need to increase their income. They need to earn more. That's the same with countries. They need to be able to come up with more funds, more resources, which can then be channeled to the development of health, education. And that's where the link comes in between taxes, which are making more funds available for countries, so they're able to spend it on the development of their country and for the prosperity of the people. But one very important thing we must remember, for taxes to play this powerful role, it's important that the tax system is designed in a way that it's efficient. It creates equity. People who earn more need to pay more, to contribute more. So everyone needs to pay their fair share, so the burden doesn't fall on the few who are in the tax net. So that's very important to remember, and that's how the linkage will be established.
Lyla, I'm looking at you. Over the past couple of days that I've interacted with you, you love explaining relationships using analogies. So using an analogy, tell us what this relationship means to you. How do you interpret it?
So the interpretation and the relationship between tax and development and tax and SDGs. So I came across this really interesting Sri Lankan proverb. It was in Sinhala. Unfortunately, I can't speak it, but I can just translate. It says something like, you cannot take medicine pills without letting the throat know. Yeah? So we kind of interpreted the medicine pills to be development goals, sustainable development goals, human rights. You talk about it, right? And then the throat is the tax system itself. And that's the connection, right? You cannot make tax policy without really focusing on what the government has committed to at the international forums and what society wants. So that link between tax and society is like taking medicine directly because the body knows what it's taking in to cure what specific aspect. So if the tax system is such that there's not enough financing, like Amna has talked about, right? We need more funding, for example. If the health sector is not being funded really well, and government has gone ahead to talk about Sustainable Development Goals number 3, which talks about good health. It simply means that the system, if it doesn't finance health properly, it's not able to resonate with the socioeconomic standing of the country. So the tax system being the throat, when it's taking the SDG pill, it should be ready to be able to finance it in such a way that every person, man, woman, and child, marginalized, vulnerable, and minority groups actually have access to universal healthcare. So that's the sort of analogy. And I think analogy is a fun way to be able to understand how tax relates to development. And I think Amna touched on the aspect about rights require resources. So tax is important for the achievement of development rights, and development rights require resources for them to be implemented.
Got it. SDG pill. I like that.
Yeah, the SDG pill. Oh, that's a nice one.
So in terms of that, what in your view do you think countries should be taking as active steps in order to make that relationship more concrete?
Okay.
And what is not happening in order to do that?
So that's a loaded question because we have almost 160 plus countries, and every country has its own socioeconomic political context. People think and perceive of SDGs in their own ways. So when we speak about countries, you have to ask yourself, who makes up the country? The government, the people, the private sector. You have to ask yourself, what is the government doing to help finance SDGs? Does it have the legal framework in place, right? Has it designed its budget in such a way that it's responding to proper financing being redistributed towards some of these goals? So I'll not mention about Sri Lanka a lot. I'll talk about Africa. Yeah. So the Africans agreed that they have to be able to finance up to 15% of their GDP towards the health sector. To date, no African country has done that. So what is the government not doing? It's not financing SDGs per their political commitments, which they had in 2010, right? In Nigeria, in Addis Ababa. Then you've got to ask yourself, what is the private sector not doing what they should do? Private sector has corporate responsibility, right? We cannot talk about development in isolation of the private sector and the public engaging. It's not only about the government. It's like what John F. Kennedy said. Do not ask what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. So what's the private sector, the public doing to help the government implement SDGs? Private sector should be able to now invest in renewable energy. They should be able to invest in technology, which is going to go towards appreciating how to design our school systems, how to design our healthcare system so that there's progressive realization of the right to health. The public have to hold the state and the corporate sector accountable in terms of, number one, give us accountability of the taxes that we are paying. How have these taxes contributed to the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 3? I keep talking about 3, but there are 17 of them, but 3 is most important. And then they also have to hold corporates accountable. That are you evading tax? And if you're evading tax, you are underfinancing our country. So there has to be that accountability. So the countries should come together to demand accountability in terms of taxes, which will create a nation of responsible taxpayers who will be much more focused on now contributing to SDGs. Yeah? Okay.
Makes sense. Picking up on that, contributing to the overall, the tax process itself. Amna, if I can ask you this, in terms of the actual process, in terms of, the actual tax collection, the administration part of it, there's a process to it, right? Can you break it down to us as to how this in a nutshell works and how does this at the end connect to the SDGs at large?
So the tax process, it starts with the budget making where the policy is made. So every year, as you understand, and Sri Lanka has recently passed their budget in April, the government sits down and formulates policies on what they plan to do for the next year. How much do they want to collect? What are their different spending needs? So the spending needs include running the civil government, the pensions, defense, and the development spending. So they earmark money on what will be spent. That's the right time for them to be able to say, okay, how much funding are we going to spend on development, and then further break down how much goes into health, how much goes into education. So those are the areas, and how much goes into infrastructure, how much will be spent on the social safety nets going to the vulnerable people, because currently, with the situation, those are the most affected. And that breakdown then leads up to, okay, how much finances do we need? And that ends up in setting up tax collection targets. So the Revenue Authority is the implementing agency really of how those policies will then be implemented. So they are given a certain target, and most of the developing world really works on targets, and the focus is, on their revenue targets. And that's when a good, well-functioning tax administration needs to make sure that it improves the compliance level of people. It brings in people who are out of the tax net, people who are in the informal sector. It includes them in. And that part is very important, because you've already spoken in your first podcast about the type of taxes. The most progressive, and by progressive, I mean people who earn more, pay more, are the personal income tax. So that should form a major part of the total revenue collection, a bigger part than the indirect taxes. Indirect taxes are regressive taxes, which means whether you buy something, or whether, someone who earns much less than you buys the same thing, or whether someone who earns much more than you buys the same thing, you all pay the same amount of tax. That's the value-added tax mainly, or the federal excise. And then there are the custom duties. So based on, the target that they have, it's very important for the tax administration, with the limited resources they have, with the limited capacity that they have, that they go for a very risk-based approach. That means they must collect information on who's paying taxes, who's not complying, and go after the people who are not complying. And once they're able to collect a certain amount of revenue, and as Lyla was saying, it's now universally accepted that at least 15% of GDP should be collected in revenues for a government to be able to at least have a basic spending on development. And we understand Sri Lanka is, much below that. So once those taxes are collected, then they are supposed to be spent as they were budgeted. So if a certain amount was allocated for development, it should go to development. But coming back a bit on the budget stage, I think it's very important for countries to understand how they're making the policies. And as Lyla said, at that point, make sure that the policies are not working against the development goals, but working towards the development goals. Whether it's reducing inequality in terms of gender, or income, or wealth. Looking at the health example that, Lyla was giving, how much is going to improve the health, how much is going to reduce the poverty. So these are things that, we must look at. But there's a big connection between raising taxes and then how they're spent.
Got it. Thank you. Since you mentioned the informal sector, Lyla, this is for you. Given your experience and expertise predominantly in the African continent, you were saying earlier how the continent itself consists of a large informal sector, about 80%. And Sri Lanka is no different, quite similar. We have an informal labor force up to about 70%. For an economy which is heavily reliant on the informal sector, what does it mean for taxation?
So the informal sector is actually the backbone of many economies. A lot of activity takes place there. A lot of transactions are made there. So there's a lot of financial flows that go through the informal sector, which the tax administrator is not able to capture, which means in terms of revenue generation, not just new old types of revenue generation, but domestic revenue mobilization, the tax administrator is not able to capture that backbone of the economy, right? So I don't know the percentage in terms of how much in Sri Lanka the informal sector generates. But when you look at the African example, right, 80% in the agricultural sector, 80% in the fisheries sector, 80% in some of the mining sector, right? There's a lot of movement of money. And those people, they're earning income and they're not being subjected to tax, which means that the tax revenue base is now constricted and the country's tax system is heavily reliant on direct taxes. But I'm also, there's a counterintuitive approach to this. There'll be an argument that in as much as they don't earn payee, personal income tax, and they're not paying direct taxation to the state, they're contributing to the indirect tax, right? Because they go out there to purchase their bread, sugar, food, clothes, whatever, and they're paying 16% VAT or 15% VAT. That's indirect taxation that goes into the tax structure. But Amna talked about regressive taxation, right? And indirect taxation is part of a regressive economy, which means that if your tax system is being heavily financed through the formal economy, because that's legitimate, and you're considering the informal economy as illegitimate, and you're not capturing taxation from that, you're losing out. But what it means is that you're still getting contribution from that informal sector in the form of indirect taxes. Then the question becomes, right, is there fair redistribution back, right? Because only, for example, in Africa, if you're working in the formal sector, then you can have access to public health care because you have to provide your payee details. If you're in the informal sector, you will not be able to access universal health care because you're not a taxpayer. So what does that say about the tax system? It says that the tax system is totally disconnected from the socioeconomic realities, which will impact sustainable development goals in the context of the informal economy. So yes, the informal economy contributes indirect taxation to the tax system, which will finance development needs, but their finances do not get redistributed back to them in the sense of public goods to some extent, right? As long as they're not registered. And that regressiveness has implications, right? And I'll probably not speak much about the implications of a regressive tax system. I'll let the audience Google, right? And really reflect on what do we mean by a regressive tax system. A regressive tax system is one that imposes tax burden on the wrong people rather than imposing it on the right people. But we leave it for the audience to do their research and figure it out.
Got it. That's good. Amna, building on that in terms of, progressive taxes, regressive taxes. Now, you work in several countries, Australia, Pakistan, Malaysia. You worked closely with the respective ministries of finance and the tax authorities helping with their taxation reform. How do you bring that harmony? How do you bring that harmonization between the respective tax policies and the attainment of the SDGs in order to address what Lyla just mentioned right now? What are some of the challenges that you've been seeing?
So you see, for a lot of developing economies, it's more about collecting revenues, meeting the tax targets, because a lot of the revenue they collect is not enough. It doesn't reach the 15% tax to GDP ratio. So a lot of it is spent maybe just on refinancing their loans or paying the interest. So at times there is an implicit, connection with the SDGs, which means they're trying to be more fiscally responsible by targeting subsidies, by trying to move more towards direct taxation, which is progressive. But there is not a very direct link where they consciously sit and say, okay, now this is, how we can link the tax with the SDGs. One reason for this is a lot of tax makers or tax policy makers, or even, at the tax administration level, are not able to link taxes with the attainment of SDGs. So that is the link that we're trying to currently make and help them understand that these are, interconnected. These two things are interconnected. And that's something, we've progressively trying to, improve that knowledge and that information. But the challenge is, as we've earlier also discussed, is one thing is the tax base is not enough. So there is not enough domestic resource mobilization for them to be able to spend on these development goals. But the other challenge we face is that, the politicians make the tax policy in isolation. Tax policy and tax administration are intertwined. But a lot of times tax policy is made, without the knowledge of tax administration being able to say, okay, how can we administer that? Which means that ends up with a lot of tax leakages and loopholes at times. then the international debate comes in. So a lot of developing countries are losing money, which is due to them because of illicit financial flows, because of base erosion, because of profit shifting. So monies that should be paid in the country, multinationals are moving them outside and not paying taxes that are due. So these challenges kind of impede on the countries being able to make that connection, because the money goes on, other things, and then countries need to borrow for development at times. And also one thing happens is that countries are not making plans for themselves because they are borrowing those funds. Those funds come with certain conditions, and then, plans which are formulated by maybe, external consultants who don't understand the country at time. So these are some of the challenges which I think need to be addressed. And we can talk later about, how they can be addressed, or what are some of the tools that we can, the countries can think about in trying to make that connection more clear.
Got it.
So let us butt in a little bit, right? Because she's touched on something that I just focused on. Yesterday I was thinking about it. The problem, the challenge with tax policy making is also the issue of ministerial discretion. So I don't know how it works for your country, but you will have, like when you read the Income Tax Act or the VAT Act, right, it will always say that, well, this is the threshold. These are the taxes that you're going to be subjected to at, source extraction every month or at the end of the year. But then it's subject to ministerial discretion, which means that if you have the Ministry of Mining, like, Africa is really strong on the mining sector, then the mining, the minister in charge of mining would be able to say, in as much as in corporate income tax has been set at 30%, because I have discretion, I can actually waive that to 10%. So what does that do? It creates a system of inconsistent tax policy making, which if you look at it in the long run, it will start impacting the revenue that can be mobilized, because the country's uniform legislation says tax at 30%. But at the same time, you have ministerial discretion, which either waives the tax completely or it reduces it to something that is just peanuts. And in the long run, you have to collect maybe $1 billion to be able to finance your development needs. But because of that discretion, you are now restricting your tax base, which in turn means you can't finance your development needs, which is what's going to push you, like Amna said, to go into borrowing, and borrowing has consequences. So everything is interconnected.
So in that context, I asked this from the both of you. When an economy is going through challenges, especially when a country is cash strapped, and when it's heavily debt burdened, what kind of tools can countries explore given this circumstance?
Okay, so policy is as good as the evidence it's based on. So the country first, I think, needs to understand where they stand in terms of their policy and how coherent it is with the SDGs. But when you say, a lot of countries are going through where they are, have very few resources, but even in this condition, there are always certain sectors which are making profits. So the country should look at really which are the sectors which are making more profits than the others, and maybe, ask them to pay maybe a higher percentage of tax, because financing the needs through their own resources is the only sustainable way to go. Because you can keep borrowing, but I said, you'll end up in a hole which you will never be able to sustain. So the need to raise your own funds that's the most critical. That's the key. So maybe look at sectors which have made, profits. Even during COVID, there were sectors which, made huge profits. So try and target those sectors. As you said, there is a lot of informal economy. They have to now be brought in. There has to be a compliance which is at a much greater level than, just having 30% in the tax net. So those things are important. But once you have, just talking about the linkage on how to link the policy with the SDGs, first understand where your policy stands. I think it's very important to run the diagnostics. And we're in the process of developing a tool which helps countries assess or measure where their policy stands in terms of all the 17 SDGs. And that would give them a baseline. and identify, okay, these are the areas where we're doing good, because, implicitly they may be doing good in achieving some of the development goals. And these are the areas where we need more support, where we need to focus our energies. And that also, I think, is important to have a shared view, right? We're talking about tax administration, the Ministry of Finance, but does the civil society also agree and understand that, these are our needs? Does the public understand? Do the other ministries, Lyla touched upon, there might be a disconnect. Do they all understand? Do the other development partners understand what our needs are, what the government's priorities are? And then, based on that data, we need to have a good, maybe 5-year strategic plan, which will focus on those areas. So these are some of the tools that we must, look into, think back, use the evidence, and then design a well-running and most efficient tax system.
Got it. A well-running and efficient tax system. Okay. You have given us a lot of food for thought, a lot to ponder about. On that very positive note, any last comments for our digital audience? Your final.
Right. So I'll probably be like, let's be radical, right? Our tax systems for most developing countries are colonial in nature. So we need to overhaul the entire tax system and redesign it suited to our socioeconomic needs, right? That's my proposal. So if we're really thinking about financing SDGs going forward, and we want to have a strong, resilient, sustainable economy for the generation to come, we've got to think about expanding the tax base. So I'm a proponent of reduce personal income tax, remove the burden from the people, push the burden towards corporates, right? Remove tax incentives and tax holidays. Though there's a debate, to some extent, tax incentives are good. But overall, on a cost-benefit analysis, they've proven disastrous for countries. Impose the wealth tax. We've got the income inequality and the wealth disparity is so significant right now. You've got to be able to establish a register about who are the rich in your country or around the world, and you've got to tax them. We're moving towards an artificial intelligence world, right? Everything is digitalized. You've got to think about imposing digital taxation. So I've got more views, but I'm just going to leave it at these four for the audience and yourselves to think about.
So, Hakshala, I think it is time that we all work together to be able to, finance the needs to help the vulnerable at this difficult time. We all need to support our governments to be able to do that. I think it's time to do the right.
Got it. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure having you both. We at UNDP Sri Lanka look forward to continuing to closely working with the both of you and hopefully have you back. Maybe on another episode sooner. Yes. Thank you so much. I'm Hakshala David, and we're signing off from UNDP Sri Lanka's podcast series, What the Tax. Stay tuned for more.